Good evening, everyone. My name is David Ellwood, and I am the Dean here at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. I wish to welcome our speaker, President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, to the John F. Kennedy Forum. Welcome, Madam President. You can put on your headphones there. Before I continue, I would first like to acknowledge Ambassador Jorge Gale, there you are, Ambassador of Argentina to the United States. And I'd also like to thank Harvard's David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies and the Institute of Politics for all the hard work that made this all possible. Before we begin, before I go into the formal introduction, let me just say a couple of words about freedom of speech and the ground rules here at the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. This forum is one of the country's premier places for public discourse and debate. For the last 30 years, we've had presidents and prime ministers, scientists and generals, candidates and ambassadors, artists and academic, all here addressing people like you in the forum. Such events are always engaging, sometimes controversial, but it's at the heart of university values that at the heart of university values is open and civil discourse that's essential to the life of the university and the future of our democracy. And so to ensure that such events are as meaningful as possible, there are just two basic ground rules. Everyone who speaks in our forum agrees to one simple principle, and that is at the conclusion of that talk, they will take unfiltered questions from the audience. In exchange, our audience must agree to listen to the speaker and not disrupt the presentation. A disruption is both unfair to the speaker and, frankly, unwise in the light of high security. If you disrupt a speech, you will be removed from the venue. When it comes time for the question and answer session, of course I encourage your participation. You're free to ask speakers probing questions. All I ask is that you do it in a respectful manner. Now let me turn to our speaker for this evening. Argentina is a nation of vast natural resources, a well-educated and sophisticated population, with a globally competitive agriculture sector and a diversified industrial base. It has a vibrant culture and a rich history. The varied and diverse backgrounds of the Argentine people is reflected in the nation's grand architecture, fine cuisine, and positive outlook. It also has a tradition of strong female leaders. Evita Perón was the nation's first female president. Our speaker is the second, but she's the first woman elected president of Argentina. President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner's presidential election victory capped a 30-year political career. She was born in the northeastern suburb of La Plata, the cosmopolitan city on the province of Buenos Aires. In 1974, she met her future husband, Néstor Kirchner, at a political rally where they both attended law school at the National University of La Plata and the active student Peronist movement. They married in 1975 and have 2 children. Following the 1976 military coup, they moved to Néstor's native province of Santa Cruz, the largest province in ruggedly beautiful Patagonia region at the southern end of the continent. With Argentina's return to a constitutional democracy in 1983, Cristina and Néstor Kirchner both became actively involved in Santa Cruz electoral politics. Néstor Kirchner was elected in 1987 as mayor of Rio Gallegos, the Santa Cruz capital. Subsequently, he was elected governor, serving 3 terms, and eventually elected president in 2003. Starting in 1989, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner was elected to the provincial deputy, and she was re-elected in 1993. She then went on to serve more than about a dozen years in different capacities as an elected official in both chambers of the Argentine National Congress, representing the province of Santa Cruz and later the province of Buenos Aires. In addition to her service in elected office, she was a very active First Lady during her first husband's administration, traveling as a goodwill ambassador throughout the country. The popular President Néstor Kirchner announced in July 2007 that he would not seek re-election. Then Senator Cristina Fernández de Kirchner ran as a candidate to succeed him, becoming president in 2007, winning just over 45% of the vote. Tragically, in 2010, her husband and political partner passed away suddenly. It was following this very sad personal loss that Cristina Fernández de Kirchner decided to run for a second term in 2011. This time, she was reelected by an even larger 54% of the vote. The President has been bold and controversial throughout her presidency. She has maintained and expanded many of the economic policies of her husband, and throughout most of her time as leader, Argentina has reported robust economic growth, often in the range of 8 to 9% a year. Despite the global financial turmoil that led to sluggish growth and a mild recession in 2009, the economic downturn was much less severe in Argentina than almost anywhere else, and rapid growth returned in 2010 and 2011. Unfortunately, in recent months, the economy seems to have stalled somewhat, and inflation has reached into double digits. In addition, the President has created a new Ministry for Science and Technology to boost innovation. In 2012, the World Telecommunication and Information Society Award was presented to the President for her numerous digital initiatives, such as Equal Connect program, which aims to reduce the digital divide across Argentina's educational system with a specific focus on developing digital content. She's expanded social programs, including a universal child benefit plan that, combined with strong economic growth, helped reduce family poverty rates. She supported measures to address the human rights abuses of the past, and in 2010, she signed into law a same-sex marriage, the first Latin American country to do so. At the same time, some of the President's policies have generated considerable controversy. Her battles with the agriculture sector, the use of foreign reserves and mandatory borrowing from pension plans to pay off external debt, and the nationalization of 51% of the YPF oil company has been popular in some circles and harshly criticized in others. Her relations with the press have been strained sometimes, and her political opponents complain about some campaign tactics. What is clear is that this President fights passionately for the policies and people she champions. It should come as no surprise that she has consistently been placed high on the Forbes list of the 100 most powerful women in the world. Please welcome the Honorable Cristina Fernández de Kirchner here this evening. Welcome, Madam President.
Well, good evening to all of you. First of all, my heartfelt apologies. I know I should have been here at 7:30 p.m. And when I was welcomed by the dean, he said he understood Latin time. I said this was no Latin time, this was actually New York time. It was the New York traffic and the air traffic at JFK that really prevented me from making it on time. After the introduction, I don't think I would need to talk too much because he explained it very well. One correction, Eva Perón unfortunately never made it to president or even vice president of the Argentine people. She would have deserved it much more than I. And secondly, one thing that I love to hear, but unfortunately it's not true, is that I was born in 1964. I would be much younger. I was actually born in 1953. I'm 59 years old. I'll be turning 60 on February 19th. I would have loved it if he had been right. Thank you very much for the comments and remarks on the administration or political process that began on May 25th, 2003. When President Kirchner took office with 22% of the vote at a very serious point in time institutionally with a crisis and following the largest default in history so far. Because what seemed a very shocking default in Argentina with $160 billion being defaulted on. When you look at some of the things going on in the Eurozone countries nowadays, we may unfortunately soon no longer be the largest default in history. The fact is that we were able to get over that very dire phase in the history of our country with an implosion of our institutional system. President has to leave office earlier and resign. There was repression in the Plaza de Mayo and in cities in the provinces with 30 people dead. And, well, this was another tragedy in the history of Argentina. You mentioned, by the way, human rights. That has been one of the pillars of our government's policies. After the dictatorship, the country suffered as from March 24th, 1976. And the policies of our administration have actually impinged upon the interests of sectors that thought they could go unpunished after the crimes committed during the dictatorship, with a lot of people who disappeared and children who went missing. And I would say that rather than polemic, the word is resistance. This is about redistributing income, although growth has been exponential for all sectors. You talked about very substantial economic growth, which is actually the highest in the 200 years of Argentine history. And now, obviously, as a result of the world crisis, the figures have gone down. In the last 12 months, we've gone from 8.9% in 2011 to 4.8 and 2.5% in the first 7 months of the year. But this makes us think not so much about the success stories we've had, but about the situation. I would certainly like to speak about a few things. Yesterday I inaugurated the Argentina chair at Georgetown, and we talked about Argentina. And apart from talking about Argentina, I would like to talk about what's going on in the world and about the world global crisis. And on Tuesday, I addressed the UN General Assembly and referred to this. And I think the crisis is no longer economic alone and has now become clearly a political crisis. And we are going to live in a different world. I think a new phase in our civilization has begun. Why do I say this? The conflicts that took place during the 19th and 20th centuries were essentially between countries of what we could call the Greco-Roman or Western roots countries. Conflicts during the 19th century which led to the independence of colonies. Well, we can also think about the independence of the US a little earlier, but on the verge of the 19th century, most Latin American countries followed suit, and then in the 20th century there was the independence of African countries. But all of these developments took place within the context of a worldview and culture that reflected the Greco-Roman roots. And following the events that were also a milestone, a true watershed moment, and by this I mean 9/11, we and the United States are the only two countries that have suffered terrorist attacks in the Americas of this kind, international terrorist attacks. And I think we will now no longer be able to solve conflicts based on a single worldview, but rather we will have to really open up our minds and cultures in order to be able to successfully tackle the challenges and resolve conflicts which are probably going to be a lot more serious than the ones we experienced in the 19th and 20th centuries. I would first like to refer to the crisis. Why has the crisis now become a political one? If you look back on 2008, and I remember it distinctly because we were also here in New York when Lehman Brothers fell. The first perception we had was that the crisis had come about because the poor were unable to pay off their mortgages. There were mortgages on mortgages. The subprime mortgages seemed to be the reason for the explosion, Fannie Mae, and so on and so forth. But a little later we realized that the problem was not that the poor had stopped paying off the mortgages, but rather that the investment banks managing the resources of the richest segments of society had built up a whole web of financial derivatives which led to the collapse of several banking institutions, and of course there were some particularly salient cases like the Madoff case, which was good telling example of what the core of the crisis is. You know, the fact that we went from a production-based economy to an economy in which it was thought that money would reproduce itself automatically by itself with no production of goods and services. The link between capital and labor is key to the generation of wealth. When we began to overcome the crisis of 2008, Argentina grew at only 0.9%, almost nothing. We did see a rebound in the world economy. Argentina again began to grow very well in 2010 at 9.2% and last year at 8.9% until the second problem came along, the Eurozone. And here we are no longer talking about indebted families or about paralyzed domestic economies, but about the indebtedness of countries with a debt to GDP ratio, which, by the way, we are very familiar with. When Argentina defaulted, the debt to GDP ratio was 160% debt relative to GDP of Argentina. This, in the Eurozone, in Spain, Portugal, and Greece, and probably in other countries, has triggered a true sovereign debt crisis, coupled not only with the inability of national states to continue to inject money into their economies, but also this is compounded by the strong indebtedness among households or families, which puts a major brake on the economy. And this gives rise to what I refer to not only as an economic crisis. You know, Argentina is also a member of the G20, and this has become a political crisis. After over 4 years without being able to find the light at the end of the tunnel, when an economic situation doesn't get a response, it becomes a political problem, because economic problems have always been sorted out through ideas, theories, and mainly political conceptions, which redirected and put back on track the conflict, because after all, the economy is also a conflict of interest. And of course, the bias may be positive or negative for some, but at least things got back on track somehow. But today, we witness a true contradiction between developed and emerging nations. Quite an unfair contradiction, by the way, and as an emerging nation, I will venture to represent emerging countries, because it is our emerging nations that have sustained world economic activity and the growth of the economy during the last decade. The economies of developed countries have grown very little, and it was actually the emerging nations that have sustained growth. Following this crisis, we are emerging countries, and I think I am speaking for several of my colleagues, we felt that faced with the impossibility of coming up with new ideas or exits, developed countries are attempting to transfer their crisis to the emerging countries, failing to realize that it is the emerging countries, our own countries, that can again give a boost to the economy for a simple reason. And this is because we have a very low debt to GDP ratio. We still have millions of fellow countrymen and women who can still consume and reactivate the wheel of consumption. And besides, the debt level of families in emerging countries is significantly lower than that that exists in developed countries. Therefore, considering measures adopted by emerging countries in their own defense to be protectionist is, in our view, a big mistake. We therefore think what needs to be done is to reconsider the instruments that we currently have. The multilateral organizations or agencies, which are the ones that our countries delegate representation to, the UN in the case of political conflict, or the IMF when it comes to managing the finances of the world, or WTO, the World Trade Organization, when it comes to trade disputes. Obviously, they are not bearing or yielding results. So, and this is nothing new. This has been happening for some time already. Yesterday at Georgetown, somebody referred to the lost decade and referred to the Brady bonds. In fact, I added it was a lost decade for Latin America, but not for those who held the Brady bonds. On the contrary, it was a great business which ended up sinking the Latin American economies with the burden of the external debt, which in the Argentine case increased even more as a result of the application of the currency board doctrine, the convertibility. You are probably all familiar with this. Former Minister of Economy Domingo Cavallo, who has lectured at Harvard, promoted this policy which suggested that a peso equaled a dollar in value. I am no economist, I haven't studied at Harvard, nor do I lecture here, but I easily realize when I look at the States and at my own country, when I consider that a currency represents the size of the economy of a country, then it becomes clear to me that a peso could never have been worth the same as a US dollar. Something was wrong. But in order to sustain this fiction for 10 years, we decapitalized Argentina through a privatization policy basically encouraged by the Washington Consensus that was applied not just to Argentina but to all of the region. But Argentina became the best student in this regard, so much so that the IMF used to invite the president to its meetings to explain the Argentine miracle, which was no such thing. It was basically about selling off assets, incurring a lot of debt to consider that the world was paying 2% interest to the dollar, and Argentina actually paid 15 or 16% at one stage. And eventually the implosion came during the government of the Alliance Party at the end of 2001. And of course, subsequently measures have been adopted which are considered controversial, but when you look at them from a strictly capitalist point of view, you will find that they are logical. We are still very harshly criticized by vulture funds here in the United States. They actually act with a very powerful lobby vis-à-vis the US Congress. Argentina restructured 94% of its debt. During the first phase under President Nestor Kirchner in 2005, and in the second phase during my own administration. What was the foundation of the theory? In a capitalist system, when you go to a bank and place your funds, and the bank gives you 20% interest, as opposed to the rest of the banks that pay only 2%, you should know that it's highly likely that that bank offering 20% at one stage may not repay the money, because if everyone pays 2 and this bank is offering 20, it's clear that there is a risk theory, the risk that you assume in the case of profits that are excessive and are not consistent with what other banks are offering. Something very similar, almost the same thing happened in Argentina. So what was the position of Argentina? That risk was to be borne by both sides. The Argentine authorities, which obviously had to shoulder the debt. Some said nothing at all had to be paid. We said that would have been absurd. And those who actually placed the funds had to share their part of the burden. And I think, well, after the so-called jumbo swap and right before the crisis in 2001, 3 months earlier, many of these investors got their money out before the collapse. And in fact, when we conducted the second restructuring, our economy minister had to visit a lot of small towns in Italy, for instance. During the first restructuring, Japan and Italy almost stayed out of it, which meant that we could hardly travel to Italy because we wouldn't have got a very good welcome. During the second restructuring, the economy ministry acted very efficiently, and traveling to each and every little town or city in Italy, because the Italian banks had placed the bonds, the debt bonds that they knew were going to be defaulted on among pensioners, old-age pensioners in Italy. So the debt was highly fragmented, and in fact, the economy ministry representatives traveled throughout Italy. It was finally possible to restructure most of the debt. Just very few people stayed out of this, and eventually an Argentine president, I myself, was able to travel to Italy, which is no minor issue. You know, although we are a highly cosmopolitan country, most of us have Spanish or Italian background. Of course, we have all sorts of communities. In fact, I myself am the granddaughter of three Spaniards. My grandparents were, three of them were Spaniards. So the history of our development in the last few years has represented unprecedented growth, the creation of 5 million jobs. You also talked about the controversy regarding the recovery of management of workers' funds, actually the pension fund managers, which had been privatized in the 1990s, and we have again taken over the administration of the funds of workers. And the sustainability fund, for guarantee purposes, has grown exponentially. We had about 98 billion pesos when we first started, and now we have over 200 billion since we took over the management of the pension funds. And during almost 10 or 12 years of private management of workers' pension funds, there was almost no growth, and what did grow a lot was the fees charged by the pension fund managers for managing the money of workers. And even worse, at the time we decided to recover the management of the pension funds, 65% of pensions in Argentina were being already paid by the government, by the federal government. So they had kept the cherry, the icing on the cake, and 65% of pensioners were still collecting from the government, and only pensioners with very high income collected through the private pension fund managers. We also adopted a payment schedule which made it possible to increase the number of pensioners in the formal pension system. So we now have the widest pension fund coverage in Latin America. 87% of the individuals in Argentina who can access pension benefits have the benefit of pensions, and the income for pensions has gone from 150 pesos, which was the minimum pension. Now my figures are escaping at this time, but we have increased by 1,300% the minimum pension, which is now 1,800 or 2,000, I believe. How much is it? It's going to be 2,200 pesos, up from 150 originally. As you will see, by managing the funds of workers, we adopted a social inclusion program, which Bernardo Klicksberg, who may be a well-known name to many of you, he's written a lot of books, and he's a senior figure of the UN. He has described it as the most important social inclusion program in Latin America. 1.2% of Argentina's GDP goes into the universal child benefit, which is intended for families with up to 5 children and who either have no work or don't have the basic minimum wage as a result of not being formally registered. Which, by the way, the minimum wage of our workers is the highest in Latin America, not only in nominal terms, but also in terms of purchasing power parity relative to the US dollar. Poverty reduction, extreme poverty reduction have been other pillars of our policy, as well as equal rights for all. You pointed out the same-sex marriage law, which we take great pride in, being the first country in Latin America to have extended rights in this way. This is something that fills us with joy. This was the only law that former President Kirchner voted upon as a legislator. He liked being in the executive, but when he was in Congress after being president, he took part very actively in promoting it so that those who didn't have the same rights as those belonging to the majority groups could have those rights. The idea was that we weren't taking rights away from anyone, but rather giving rights to others who until then didn't have the rights that most of us in Argentina enjoyed. Something basic and key. Of course, this gives rise to some resistance among some groups. It is impossible to undergo a process of transformation as profound as we have had in Argentina since 2003 without ruffling some feathers or, encountering some opposition in some groups, let alone the issue of human rights. Until 2003, those who had perpetrated crimes against mankind had kidnapped, tortured, and made disappear people who are still missing, and they were still walking free in our country. And this was something that applied not only to Argentina. I remember I once traveled with President Kirchner to Paris on his first trip as president, and we were received by former French President Jacques Chirac, who no one could label as left-wing or, conservative. As soon as we sat down in his office at the Élysée, he looked at us, and the first thing he did was look at President Kirchner, and he said, French society can't understand how someone, and he referred to Captain Astiz, which you may know had a huge repercussion in France due to the disappearance of two French nuns. In fact, I was at the French Senate, and I heard the same complaint or demand. French society, President Chirac said, can't understand how people who have committed such heinous offenses are not just walking free, but do so thanks to laws enacted by Parliament. Because, of course, impunity is always a possibility. Someone can escape justice, can escape the courts, perhaps because the courts can't find the person, the police can't spot them. But when it is one of the powers of the state that determines that the person is not to blame and is left free, it gives you the feeling that you are living in a pre-democratic system. I always say that if one of the state's powers introduces a law that or rule that enables you to commit crimes freely, then you are not living in a democratic society. That's prior to the emergence of democracy. And of course, some sectors supported the military dictatorship or have a certain view of the role played by dictatorships that is different from that we have, and I think it's a completely different view of what human condition is and of what sort of a society or system we want to live in. And in this connection, in connection with human rights, at the UN General Assembly, I also condemned once again the savage murder of the U.S. ambassador to Libya, Chris Stevens. Of course, we express our sympathy to the United States and to Mr. Stevens' family. And I stress that we need to take a different view in the face of developments around the world at present. Often, an erroneous view or perception can lead us to make mistakes. When the so-called Arab Spring began, I think in a rather naive and too hasty way, it was believed that this had to do with a wish to become westernized in Muslim countries, in Arab countries. And in fact, I think this was a misinterpretation of the events. I believe one of the things we need to understand, and this is why I talk about this new phase in civilization, something that I also stated yesterday at Georgetown, just like we will probably never choose to wear a headscarf, or perhaps I will not want to walk 2 steps behind a man, and if you are not a Muslim, you may choose not to wear a turban. But some people may wish to do just that, and they may not want to dress the way we do or do the things we do because they have a different culture, religion, and worldview. And I say this because I believe it will help us understand the new world, and what originally seemed an Arab Spring has become an autumn for, or even winter for some. I think this requires that we all take a very broad-minded view, free of any bias, and with as open a mindset as possible. And I like to say this at academic fora such as this one, where we can discuss and have a debate, and we can actually compare what is happening in the world, the different events, and also see how we can seize the opportunity to look at this not from a clash of civilizations approach or end of history approach. If I think in the terms of Huntington or others, after all, history never ended when the Berlin Wall fell. History won't ever end. It's a contradiction in terms to say that. But I think this new phase in civilization should help us rethink and reconsider our theories and adapt instruments. And in this regard, we take a very critical view of multilateral organizations, the way they're working, because I think they harbor the potential for creating conflict between our common space. We countries that may be termed heirs, or those that follow the legacy of the Greco-Roman culture, and we don't want to have conflict with other cultures. And I believe the economic concerns will further compound the issue. When I see things happening in the United States, for instance, when mortgages are foreclosed on and people are left out on the streets, the banks leave the houses unoccupied and empty, and people are left without a job and without a home, or when I see that a greater focus is placed on solving the problems of banks rather than the actual problems of society through programs that will again inject funds into the real economy, into the real life economy, in order to once again boost the world economy. I think we are barking up the wrong tree. We speak from our humble experience. When we decided to introduce the universal child benefit, we were moved not only by a sense of justice and equity, but also by a sense of economic rationality. Why do I say this? Because lower income segments, the most vulnerable, are the ones that normally can save less. Therefore, all the money that goes to the most vulnerable, in addition to reducing social vulnerability and somehow creating greater equity and justice and equity meaning that they have a job and are not reliant on government help. I mean, that is a way to activate the economy by helping those sectors. If we also look at the enormous concentration of income that has taken place in recent decades, you can see that in the United States too. It's a country in which the middle class was the largest segment, and today 1% of the population holds virtually 25% of GDP and manages almost 40% of the country's economy. Inequality also creates a feeling of injustice, and these inequalities exist between countries. I have referred to the conflict to do with the trade and currency wars between developed countries and emerging countries. And this has to be overcome not by applying double standards, but rather by a true balance in trade. Let me give you an example. The panels at the WTO, the panels deal with practices that are considered to be protectionist. When you go to a WTO panel, if you are an emerging country, of course, out of the 24 members of the panel, 22 are from European countries that have non-tariff barriers and protectionist measures and subsidies for agriculture, and they have done so for a long time. Argentina has been accused of protectionist practices, and for decades we haven't been able to get Argentine beef into the United States, and this is not due to phytosanitary reasons. Well, you also talked about the quality of our products. So I think that dispenses with the need for me to explain that we are looking at protectionist barriers, non-tariff barriers, which are applied by developed countries vis-à-vis emerging countries. Finally, let me say that this growth experienced by the whole region of Latin America, and I will talk not only about Argentina, I would also like to talk about other countries in the region. Brazil, our main partner, we also need Brazil to fare well, very well. Part of Argentina doing well depends on Brazil doing well. Brazil has a significant surplus with Argentina, just as the United States has a surplus with Argentina and Brazil. Ambassador Arguello is an indefatigable fighter in order to try and dispel and debunk these myths that exist in some institutional sectors in the United States. The United States has a surplus, even though U.S. foreign trade runs a deficit. The country has a surplus of $4 billion with Argentina, of approximately $8 billion with Brazil, even though the U.S. current account shows a deficit and the trade balance too. But the United States issues dollars, the international reserve currency, so the deficit can be unlimited here. But the depreciation of the dollar also revalues currencies, and today in this priceless or a world without prices, since there is no longer a notion of competitiveness, because at the end of the day you see there's a big time trade war and currency war, we urgently need to come up with global instruments that are not the ones we currently have. It's clear that the International Monetary Fund has no solution to offer to administer finances. It hasn't been able to manage finances over the last few decades anywhere in the world, nor has the WTO been able to complete the Doha round, because there has been no agreement reached between emerging and developed countries. The sacrifices demanded of our emerging countries are far greater than what the developed countries are willing to offer in exchange at these rounds. Well, and of course there's the UN Security Council, which Argentina will be joining as from next year, 2013 and 2014, that is. And for the first time we will have a woman ambassador of Argentina to the United Nations. This is the first case in our history. I think this is also a sign of the times and of these more equal times in terms of gender equality. But the Security Council has made it possible for permanent members not to abide by UN resolutions and even systematically violate them, as is the case with the UK in relation to the question of the sovereignty over the Malvinas Islands, and all other permanent members of the Security Council, or the others that are not permanent members, have to abide by every single rule. I think the Security Council has lost some of its operativeness. By this I mean the Security Council should have instruments to solve conflicts around the world in order to enable it to, for example, find a solution to the conflict in Syria or in the Middle East. The Security Council was born out of the San Francisco Charter and after the Second World War. With the advent of the Cold War, the world was divided into a bipolar world, and there was the fear of nuclear holocaust. So all those who could trigger the nuclear holocaust were actually sitting on the Security Council, basically the victors of the Second World War, and thus the mutual fear would neutralize any threats upon the world. The problem is that those who now threaten the world are not even on the Security Council or in the UN. Global terrorism is not represented at the UN or at the Security Council. The former enemies within the Security Council now get along very well. So the Security Council, as conceived of following the San Francisco Charter as an instrument for world security and peace, has lost its purpose or its ability to operate, because this is a new scenario. The photograph of the Second World War, with the world divided into two halves, is over. It's now a different world, and we want and expect and intend to give solutions to a different world with different problems, different circumstances, different players, new players, and we can't expect to solve problems with the same old instruments. This obviously can't work, and we need to reconsider that. Of course, we won't claim to have any solution. If I did have a solution to all of these problems, I would probably be speaking elsewhere. But I think these are some challenges, this is some food for thought and for our debate, and we need to consider this to build a fairer, more equitable and equal society between countries and essentially within countries. I would like to thank the university for the invitation. I would like to thank you for your introduction. And what I have explained about Argentina doesn't mean that Argentina is heaven or Disney World. There is no such place. Well, Disney World does exist, but in Orlando. Those who have been there love it, but it lasts just a while. Depending on the money you have, you may spend 2, 3, or 5 days, but at the end, you have to leave. You may go from a nicer house to an uglier house. You may have more or less money, but sometime you have contact with reality, and we can't claim to live in Disney World anywhere in the world. But if you compare Argentina in 2001 or even in 2003, a country with no hope, with people chanting a slogan, they're asking for all politicians to leave, which we now see in Greece and in Spain. In Argentina, a very large percentage of the population, 25% of people, had no job. Youths were queuing up outside the Spanish embassy at the time. I remember that very clearly, because I used to leave the Senate building of Argentina in Buenos Aires, and I used to go by the Spanish consulate, and there were actually people queuing up for others. Creative as we are, some Argentines used to charge 50 pesos at the time, I think, to queue up for others who wanted to take the papers to the Spanish consulate. And that was Argentina back then, with scientists leaving. I'm very pleased that you refer to the creation of the Minister of Science and Technology, which we consider to be one of the main achievements of our administration. We are allocating 6.47% of GDP to education, and the latest budget has also allocated the highest figure ever to universities. We have launched a program called Connect for Equality, which involves giving each high school student in our state-run schools, which are also free of charge, just like our universities are. I graduated from a state university, and I studied free of charge. We are one of the few countries in which you have free universities, and in fact we get students coming from all over Latin America to study in Argentina. Of course, there are still a lot of things left to do. We still have 32% unregistered workers. We still have other situations like 7.2 or 7.3% unemployment. We had brought it down to 6.9, but now it's gone up again. There's also the seasonal element, of course, but the world crisis has also had a bit of an impact. And also foreign currency reserves. You also talked about a controversial measure, which was the payment with reserves. Actually, the controversy was that many didn't want us to get rid of our debt. In fact, we have accumulated, well, when President Kirchner first took office, we only had $9 to $10 billion in reserves at the central bank. So what we decided to do was to use the central bank reserves to pay debt, because we were paying interest at 0.8% a year, because that was deposited in Basel, and if we wanted to go out to the capital market to pay our debt, they would charge 12 or 13%. I mean, rather than a controversial measure, this had to do with common sense and economic rationality. I mean, you wouldn't have $40 billion at 8% and go and try to get $2 billion at 14%. And by the way, the debt related to the so-called corralito, which was the confiscation of deposits in 2001, and which led to the tragic days of December 20th and 21st, 2001, that debt was paid in full this year through a bond, the Boden 2012. We paid 2.3 billion as part of the last payment, and we're also paying for debt that was incurred by previous governments, because this administration has not indebted Argentina. On the contrary, we have reduced our debt like never before in our history, from the $5 or $6 billion when the military dictatorship took over in March 1976, all the way up to the end of 2001, with a debt equal to 160% of GDP. Today, the public sector and private sector debt in the aggregate in Argentina amounts to 13% of GDP, and the foreign currency denominated debt is 8%. The rest is intra-public sector debt, in other words, related to instruments held by the Social Security Agency or other government agencies. So the debt reduction process has been unprecedented in our history, and it's put an end to the severe constraint placed until recently by the external debt. I think everyone who lived through the 80s and 90s and has visited the country will remember the slogans against the IMF, because that was basically the symbol of dependence and of the inability to have our own independent autonomous policies. Again, we are not in the best of worlds, but we are in a world in which we have substantially improved our situation. At least that's the way most Argentine people have understood it. After all, following 8 years in office, we won by 54.11% of the vote in Argentina, which reflects the fact that a significant majority of the Argentine people considers that, of course, not that all is perfect, no one votes for perfection, but at least it is considered we have done a good job. In addition to the figure being quite high, after all, we got the highest number of votes, only second to General Perón. I would never have aspired to outdo him. I think that no one would have accepted that, would have liked me to do that, and that was obviously not my intention. But I mean, we feel proud to have received that sort of support. After all, we have lost elections. We had to go through some very serious conflicts and confrontations and differences. You referred to the agricultural sector, the the agricultural taxes. By the way, we have recently introduced these floating taxes at the request of the biodiesel producers due to the fluctuations in international prices. But anyway, that's water under the bridge. These conflicts have been overcome, and what matters is that we need to join efforts. And by this I don't mean just the Argentine people, but the international community, in order to deal with and overcome this crisis, which is clearly becoming political in nature. You see governments in Spain, from a party to like the PSOE, to a right-wing government like the one of Mr. Rajoy, and still the problem continues, because the problem doesn't have to do with right or left wing. The problem is to conceive of growth for a country in ways other than with equity and justice. I think sooner or later we'll have to see a major debt restructuring in these crisis-ridden countries, because otherwise they will be unable to pay off so much debt, even more so with austerity and adjustment programs. So I wanted to talk not only about Argentina, but about the world. Speaking about Argentina only would be looking too much at our own belly button, and we are not living in an unrelated world. We are a highly mutually dependent world, and whatever happens anywhere has some impact somewhere else. So we certainly hope that the leaders of countries that are now going through serious crisis, and after all, countries whose leaders have also had their share of responsibility as a result of not seeing what was coming their way. We hope that they will be more willing to listen to new possibilities, strategies, ways and policies. It's very unlikely that the same medicine that caused the illness will cure the patient. So you'll either have to change doctors or medicines, or both things. Thank you very much. And I'll be looking forward
Thank you very much, Madam President. We now have time for questions. I would like to just remind those of you that have been here before and those of you for the first time what a good question at the Kennedy School consists of. First, you start by identifying yourself. Second, it is short and contains one thought. That means one question. And third, your question ends with a question mark. So with that, I'd like to start right here.
Hola, mi nombre es Mariana Figueira Rizzo, soy de Argentina. Estudio acá en la
I'm Mariana Figueira Rizzo, I'm from Argentina. I study at the Kennedy School, and this is a very important year for our U.S. friends and for those of us who study at the School of Government, because it'll be the election for U.S. President. So the question I'd like to ask is, what sort of an impact do you think that may have on our country, the results? And there's also an election at the Students' Union, at the Students' Association. Yes, exactly. Tomorrow we'll have the vote. I'm interested. I want to hear all about it. We have the second round. Can we ask? May I ask? We have the second round. I see. So it's like us. So no one made it to 50%. We are close. And you're running. Yes, I'm a candidate, and we may have two Argentine presidents in the same week. Well, all the best for the election. So, quite a question. I don't know. It's quite a tricky question to answer, because someone could suggest that I'm meddling with domestic politics. I'm here as the president of Argentina. I think it would be inappropriate. Not that I wouldn't have the courage to speak out. Many know that I do speak out and more. But I don't think it would be quite appropriate to give an opinion on the eve of an election. I do have my views and thoughts, which you can all probably imagine. I'll leave it up to your imagination. Not that I want to dodge the question, but I think that is most appropriate. If it was just Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, a senator here, representing a political group and not the country as a whole, I would probably give my opinion unambiguously. But here I am as president of the Argentine Republic and representative of 40 million people, those who voted for me and those who didn't vote for me, those who like me and those who don't. So I have to skip the answer and wait until November 6th. Yeah, January 6th would be Epiphany. Jorge Masal, I study at Kennedy as well. I'm from Argentina as well. Why do countries like Chile, Brazil, Colombia and Peru have such growth and economic development with no restrictions upon foreign currency or inflation? Why can't we do the same thing in Argentina? Well, the currency purchase curbs are actually a headline. In Argentina, unlike what happens in Colombia or Chile or in Brazil, we have the largest number of dollars after the United States. After the United States, the second country, or the country with the second highest number of dollars, is Argentina. About $1,300 to $1,700 per inhabitant in Argentina, as opposed to Brazil, which has only $6 per inhabitant, and even though it is the 6th or 7th largest economy, and there are no currency exchange restrictions. In fact, the exchange regulations provide for 120 categories that allow for the purchase of dollars. And by the way, when I won the election last year, we actually have introduced a system of open compulsory primaries for all political parties, similar to the United States, and we had the primaries in August. Between August, September and October, after the strong rumors, which were obviously biased and influenced by media, that suggested that after my election in October would devalue, Argentine or people in Argentina bought $4.768 billion just for hoarding purposes, for, you know, to save in dollars, something which doesn't happen in Chile, Colombia or Brazil. In Brazil, if you want to pay in dollars, they won't take dollars. The prices of houses in Brazil are denominated in reales, the Brazilian currency, and if you go to Brazil, you need reales to spend, and the same thing in Chile and the same thing in Colombia. If those $4.768 billion hadn't left the way they did between August, September and October, just with another extra $900 million, we would have been able to pay the $2.3 billion of the bonds I referred to, and the debt coupon we'll have to pay at the end of the year, and which we are obviously going to pay with reserves. We could have paid that earlier, and it was even said that we were not going to pay the Boden bond 2012, and that we were not going to pay in dollars, that we were going to pay in pesos. All of those are speculative maneuvers or attacks against the value of the currency in order to benefit a small segment of the population, because statistically those who buy dollars out of 100% of all Argentines accounts for 12%. So there is no such lock or padlock, as they call it, the cepo. If you are a producer and you need dollars in the exchange market, there are over 120 categories that allow the purchase of dollars. What we did away with was so-called hoarding, which enabled an individual or corporation to buy every month for no purpose, just for saving purposes, $2 million a month. This doesn't happen in any country, in any of the countries you mentioned. Did you know that in Brazil you can't place time deposits in dollars if you want to deposit money. And a time deposit in Brazilian dollars, you can't do that. But in Argentina, that is allowed. So I think there is a lot of ignorance in this regard and a lot of media manipulation of the matter. I think, well, at least students should try and seek more information on what's happening in our countries. Let me add one more thing. Something which the foreign minister told me. He had meetings with his Colombian counterpart. Recently, they have discovered in Argentina the operation of certain gangs which are called Colombian gangs, Colombian citizens committing crimes in Argentina. Of course, the Colombian Foreign Ministry is very concerned about this because of the bad image the country suffers from as a result of this, but they have told us that it's surprising to see the amount of dollars circulating in Argentina, something which is not the case in Colombia, where the regulations are really strict, and anyone who has over $1,000 and has that in cash is seen almost as a drug trafficker. I understand that Argentina has a strong dollar-oriented culture, especially after March 24th, 1976, when the financial institutions law was adopted following the dictatorship that began in March 1976, and the focus was mainly on finance and not on production. And then, of course, to this was added the convertibility period. People had dollars, and obviously, in the end, those who had dollars had neither dollars or pesos at the end. And again, I don't want to repeat the mistakes of history. I want to be a serious and responsible president that will guarantee that Argentina has dollars for importers to be able to buy the basic inputs they need to produce anything from oncological drugs to all basic inputs any country needs to import. Since I also have to pay the debt incurred by other previous administrations, as I just said, I have to pay this 3.5 billion debt coupon at the end of the year, plus the discount. Well, you know, the whole debt accumulated in the 90s. We have debt from the 90s, from the 80s, from 2001. We have these Boden bonds. We have a whole menu of debt. And curiously enough, none of those instruments was created by this administration that is paying off debts in dollars. So obviously, as president, I have the obligation to look after those reserves. And Argentines who they said that rumors began to spread that no one would be able to travel. We all know that here in the United States and in any country, in order to travel, you need a credit card for a simple reason. Even if you paid for the hotel in cash, you need to leave a signed voucher, because otherwise they won't let you check into any hotel. I think, in addition to this dollar mentality in Argentina, let me tell you, I also had a time deposit in dollars. So I'm not blaming anyone. I am also an Argentine, but in addition to being an Argentine citizen, I'm also the president of all Argentines. So I need to look after everyone, the 40 million. Even those who sometimes inadvertently contribute to economic paths or situations that have a bad impact on everyone. And I remember the time when everyone, well, everyone, a group of society could travel because others were left out of the production circuit. The road demonstrations and roadblocks began before 2001, when people were left without jobs in Patagonia. And this is no padlock on currency exchange purchases, because that would suggest that no one can use dollars. And another point is the formal registered economy. I think many people are very annoyed because perhaps they can't produce evidence of the source of the money they have. If you want to buy dollars and you don't want to say where you got the money from, you don't want to pay tax, and you want to go abroad, well, the country would last very little. If all 40 million wanted to do that, the country wouldn't last very long. I can understand that Some people may be angry. It's impossible to make everyone happy, but my obligation as president is to manage the country, conceiving of it as a whole and making sure that it works for the majority of Argentines. I think they can travel very well. I saw a lot of Argentine people, even in Las Vegas, cheering for boxer Maravilla Martinez, which I think was great. I saw Argentines here. Well, you are an Argentine yourself, and you're here. So you probably don't have dollar problems, right? And you probably don't have problems with dollars either. So the number of Argentines who can't even make it to the University of La Matanza in the greater Buenos Aires area, and I'm mentioning that university. You are lucky enough to study in Harvard. Do you think you can really talk about these currency purchase curbs? Isn't it a bit unfair? It's my view.
Right up here.
Buenas, me llamo Martín Molina y soy venezolano.
I'm Martin Molina. I'm from Venezuela. Venezuelan, I know where you're coming from. I run into Venezuelans at all universities who ask questions. Go ahead. I know, you can ask me about Chavez.
No, no, no.
Okay. So you'll be more original then. In view of the constant attacks on regarding media and intellectuals, not necessarily belonging to the opposition, but rather critical of your government, they have been attacked. Do you think there is plurality and freedom of speech and expression in Argentina? I don't think there was ever as much freedom of speech and expression in Argentina as there currently is. In Argentina, we would never have had a situation like the one you had here in the States when a New York Times journalist went to prison because she failed to disclose the source regarding when she said that the wife of an ambassador worked for CIA. This couldn't have happened in my country ever. First of all, because the Constitution provides for protection of your sources. And it's enough if you just read any newspaper or tune into any TV station and you can see the things that are said about any leader, and mainly about myself as president or about members of my administration. And I was the president that sent to Congress a bill to decriminalize libel and slander for journalists. In other words, to prevent journalists from being prosecuted for libel and slander. And before, a journalist would probably have had to pay not only damages, but could also be imprisoned. I sent a bill to Congress, and this was made into law, the decriminalization of libel and slander for journalists. So any journalist can say whatever they please about whoever they wish. In fact, they do every day. And I think, honestly, I saw you read the question. Perhaps you may not remember very well what it is you want to tell me, but I think there is a lot of freedom in Argentina. I mean it, and you know that.
Right over here.
¿Qué tal? Soy Juan Maqueira.
Juan Maqueira from General Pico, in the province of La Pampa. I would first like to thank you for being here and for this unique opportunity to ask you questions. There are lots of things we'd like to ask. I'll ask one of the questions. Many people, or at least, I don't know if many, but there are people in your government and in Congress who are talking about a possible constitutional reform in order for you to be re-elected for a third term. In fact, there was a demonstration, in my view, quite big in Buenos Aires and in other provinces around the country, you may have a different opinion. The question is, why haven't you addressed the matter? Do you wish to be re-elected for a third term, and do you intend to reform the constitution? It's not about what I want, but about what I can or must do. And in fact, this is an abstract matter. It's a moot question. The constitution does not allow my re-election as president. So it goes beyond what I wish or must do. In my country, a lot of things are discussed. Whether there will be a re-election or not, whether there has to be a constitutional reform or not, whether we have to have a presidential system or a parliamentary system, if we need to legalize abortion or not, if people who are 16 years old can vote or not, if we should decriminalize the use of drugs or not. There's a lot of debate and discussion in Argentina, but it's not my responsibility to reform the constitution, nor do I wish that, because it doesn't depend on me, nor has it ever depended on any party, because except for the reform of 1949, all constitutional reforms, and especially the one in 1994, was not the result of the work of a single party. It was actually the result of the work of both parties. Peronism had won the election very comfortably in 1991 and 1993, and still it needed the support of the other party, the opposition party, the radical party, to introduce the reform 2 years later. So we need a two-thirds, an intensified majority to reform the constitution. I think it's a very wise requirement. So I think the debate may exist among certain sectors of society, but it has nothing to do with me.
Right here.
Thank you very much. I am Manuel, I'm from El Salvador, and as a Latin American studying at Harvard, some may think that I have no right to speak, but I feel that I have the duty to ask. I have nothing to do with that. No, of course. So I have nothing to do with Harvard. I don't know if they let people from El Salvador speak or not. It would appear that. Based on your last answer, since you have the international political stature you have, what are your plans once you leave office in 2015? After what happened to me in my personal life, I have become used to having no plans. If you had told me what could happen to me as a woman, and I thank you for referring to me as a leader with political stature. I like it even better when a Salvadorian says it to me rather than an Argentine, even more so. But I have become used to not planning, because I am a true believer, and even more so in recent times. And I think there is a sentence that reflects what I feel. And if you want to see God smile, tell him your plans. And I experienced this firsthand. I never thought I would experience what I've gone through. And that has given me an understanding of life, not only from a personal perspective, but also from a political perspective. All those big planners and strategists, those who say they're going to do this, or things will be this way or this other way, I think you should take one day at a time in life, and I think I'm doing that, living each day as if it were the last. And I also govern as if it was the last day, with all of my power and strength, that it was the last thing I have to do. And this I learned based on my personal experience. So I no longer plan as much as I used to. Thank you.
Right up here.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'm Lynn. I'm from the United States, but I lived 6 years in Argentina. What I would like to ask, I understand you are not an economist, as you said, but I would like to know how one can explain the increase in your personal wealth from 2 million pesos to 79 million pesos in 8 years' time. I don't know where you got those figures from, but that has not been the case. There have been claims and allegations, not only against myself, but against other officials and individuals, and actually the courts have dealt with that. I have always had a certain financial position, which did not start when I took office. I don't know how long you've lived in Argentina, but everyone knows that I've always practiced as a lawyer. My law firm was one of the largest in my part of the world, and I can render accounts for each and every one of my assets, and in fact I have done so, and I've had to do that, just like any citizen. In this case, you know, as a government official, we are the only country in the world where the burden of proof is reversed. You're an economist. Well, I'm a lawyer. And, well, you're obviously innocent until proven guilty. The only case in which this is not so is in the case of unlawful enrichment on the part of a government official. And we have actually been, you know, there have been demands and claims for us to prove a number of things. There have been expert reports and appraisals, and 20, 30 experts from the courts have had to deal with these matters, and it's all gone through the whole judicial process, but the figures you talked about are not right. We had a certain economic position, that financial position, which has been the result of the fact that I worked all my life and have been a very successful lawyer. Now I am a successful president. Thank you.
We have time for just 2 more questions.
Muy buenas noches, me llamo Juliana Tortuga, soy colombiano.
Juliana Tortuga, I'm from Colombia, but now live in Panama. I would like to ask about Paraguay. How do you view bilateral relations between Argentina and Paraguay at present, and specifically in the future? How do you see the future of Paraguay and Mercosur? Well, relations with Paraguay should be considered not only on the bilateral level. They're members of Mercosur, so apart from the relations we have in terms of the fact that we share a binational company, Yacireta, a project that we have completed during our administration, but the question of Paraguay was first discussed within Mercosur and then within UNASUR, and was decided to suspend Paraguay in its political rights, in voting rights, but no economic sanctions were imposed, and this had to do with this institutional coup against President Lugo. And the presidents that decided this, Presidents Mujica, Rousseff, and myself, decided that as soon as the institutional situation is normalized, during the next election in Paraguay, Paraguay will again become a full member with all rights. As for the bilateral relations, I can assure you that they are often institutional matters. If you go to the province of Formosa, or the province of Misiones, or if you go to Corrientes, you will see that in economic terms and in terms of relations between Argentina and Paraguay, and the same thing applies to the Brazilian side, nothing at all has changed. In fact, what Mercosur has tried to do is to set a clear example of respect for the democratic clause that was introduced in Ushuaia, and this means that the institutional procedures must be respected. A sham impeachment process that is dealt with in hardly 24 hours. I mean, I have actually headed an impeachment as the chair of the Constitutional Affairs Committee when a case was brought against 2 former Supreme Court justices. The procedure took 2 months. There has to be due process of law, there's the accusation, the defense, the production of evidence by both sides, well, the claims, the pleadings, the expert studies. You know that such a procedure can't develop in only 24 hours. But we have no hostility against the people of Paraguay. There are differences with the authorities of the country, but we decided there would be no economic sanctions because those sanctions do not make the rulers or the government suffer, but the people.
Last question.
I'm from Argentina as well. I also feel highly privileged to be among the few Argentines that can ask you questions. I will speak to that. I'd like to ask you, After seeing the non-transparent inflation, crime and poverty rates, don't you think it would be the time to do some self-criticism and to accept some other views? First of all, let me answer because I didn't answer your previous mate, but we were at Harvard, come on. We're at Harvard, come on. Those things are for La Matanza in the greater Buenos Aires area, but not for Harvard. You know, saying that I'm one of the few privileged Argentines, well, perhaps because you're here at Harvard and you don't find out about things. But I talk to millions of Argentines. 20,000 ceremonies I attend. I talk to journalists in Formosa, in Córdoba, wherever I am. I don't know where this comes from, that I don't talk, or that I'm, you know, that I can't speak, that I'm mute. Do you think if people didn't talk to me, or I didn't talk to people, they would have voted for me? 54%, 54% of the population. Do you think they would have voted for someone who doesn't speak? I mean, come on. You've got academic standards. You can't repeat parrot fashion what 2 or 3 journalists write. Let's try and start talking a little seriously about what's happening in Argentina in relation to the media, which have ceased to be media, mass communication media, and are now opposition media. If you want to talk about journalism, let's talk about the media and about the regulation of the media. You live in the United States, a country in which there is a strong regulation of the media. In the United States, no one who owns written media, the owner of the New York Times or the owner of the Washington Post, can hold TV or radio licenses or be the sole owner of the only factory of paper for printing newspapers. And besides, there is a certain number, maximum number of licenses they may hold for radio, television, or other means of communication. 3 years ago exactly, and I think the School of Law and School of Government is particularly relevant in this case, I will ask you, please raise your hands if you know whether a new media law has been adopted or not in Argentina. Those who know whether it has been enacted, the new media law? Those who do know, please raise your hands. Please raise your hand a little higher so I can see you. Those who do know. You do. You also know. In 2009, so almost 3 years ago, the media law was enacted, which provides that there can be no more than 24 cable television licenses, and I believe 4 frequencies, or radio frequencies, are now held by the same person or group. And the problem is that the media monopoly that exists in Argentina, and which not only controls paper factories purchased during the dictatorship, and they also control many newspapers, and they refuse to comply with the law enacted by Congress 3 years ago by seeking injunctions. And finally, the court has ruled that on December the 7th, they will have had to comply with the law, because you can't hold 240 cable television licenses and 9 open network licenses, because that constitutes a monopoly. And this, by the way, is the Kennedy School of Government. If there is something that has been a hallmark of this society, has been the fact that it has always had strong antitrust and anti-monopolistic rules. In fact, Microsoft, one of the largest companies in the world, has often been fined due to monopolistic issues. In Argentina, this didn't used to be the case. The media law was also enacted with an unprecedented participation by many sectors. It's the first bill sent to Congress after the, a draft was submitted, a preliminary bill, which wasn't only mine. It was a democratic coalition representing many non-government organizations, trade unions, universities, and intellectuals, who came up with a preliminary bill that was discussed at over 25 fora, universities, trades unions, throughout the country, far and wide. Additions and modifications were introduced, and the bill was finally sent to Congress, and it was made a law by wide majorities, not only of my own party, but also of the opposition parties, providing for certain adjustment clauses to prevent monopolies, which is the worst thing that can happen to a society. If a single economic sector, because besides, journalism is no longer the way it used to be practiced by Benjamin Franklin or Mariano Moreno, candlelit journalism. Nowadays, all companies are true economic holdings, and journalism, which was mainly born as a political exercise, think about the French revolutionaries. You can still see the printing press where they used to produce their papers in France, or think about Benjamin Franklin and his newspaper, or Mariano Moreno, who founded La Gaceta, which was the trade gazette, which was true journalism. Journalism was born as a political instrument, and following the transformation into huge holdings and concentrated groups, not only in our country, but all over, you will have heard about the Murdoch scandal in Britain. If we speak about freedom and journalism, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there are several journalists prosecuted by the Argentine judiciary alongside former intelligence chiefs and members of the military who used to hack, well, as in the case of Murdoch, who used to intercept telephone communications and conversations. They used to use that to pressure and you know, put pressure on people, and some very well-known journalists were involved. I'm surprised that you haven't heard about this, considering that this is such a prestigious university. But I wish to mention this because this has happened, and I think we should be sensible. You were looking the other way. I thought you'd lost something. Let me say that the problem is that there is so much freedom that there is a monopoly that doesn't accept the law and doesn't even recognize the application authority voted by Congress and recognized by the Argentine Supreme Court. So for those of you who were not aware of this regulation in Argentina, let me say that we are still lagging far behind as compared with the United States in the field of freedom of expression, which is something you can exercise, provided you have places where you can express your thoughts, and provided that not all of the channels for expression belong to the same media. It's interesting to see how certain networks take sides here openly for certain candidates or for certain government policies, which is not wrong. I don't believe in objective journalism. I think journalism should have an opinion. I think everyone looks at the world from a certain perspective, ideology, and interest, but you're not one of the few Argentines, perhaps because you live here in Harvard, of course. Well, I don't come to Harvard very often, but let me tell you, there are millions of Argentines who talk to this president all the time. It would be foolish to think otherwise. I mean, I talk to journalists, I talk to trades union members. The thing is that journalism in Argentina, in my view, has become self-referential. I'm surprised. I haven't come to the School of Journalism. I have come to the School of Government, and I'm president. And I'm surprised that everything is centered around whether I do or talk or not to a certain journalist. I think it's not consistent with academic standards. I was expecting a different kind of analysis or questions that had more to do with government and School of Government rather than these issues that you seem to, after all, you must be spending your dollars here, which must be quite a bit. I've been told that Harvard is quite expensive. So, so rest assured, I do talk to a lot of people. And can you repeat the question? What did you want to know then? You forgot now.
No, quería saber si podía empezar a ver más
If there
una
could be
autocrítica
more
y poder
self-criticism,
permitir un poco
perhaps,
más
and if
este tipo
you
de
could allow
conferencias donde
more
pueda
of these
expresarse un poco
conferences
más
so as
claramente
to
con preguntas.
allow questions
A ver,
to be answered.
mira. Yo te digo, mis funcionarios,
My
mis funcionarios
officials
hacen conferencias
organize conferences every day.
casi todos
Nearly
los días
every
hay
day
uno
there is some
explicando,
official
desmintiendo y
explaining,
Pero en
denying,
realidad, también llega un
clarifying.
momento en que uno
But
dice
there
una
come
cosa,
points when
publican
you say one
otra.
thing and another one
En
gets
realidad,
published.
fíjate, voy a leerte
I'll
un titular de un
read
diario
out
después de mi discurso
a
el otro
headline
día en la
of a newspaper
ONU.
after
En
my
la ONU,
intervention at the
al otro
UN.
día
The
que yo
day
hablé
after
sobre el
I
tema de AMIA,
spoke
sale
on
un
the
titular en un
AMIA
diario
Jewish Community Center
donde dice
bombing,
fuerte giro de
and
la
it said
presidenta
major
negociando
turnaround of the
por la
president. She
AMIA.
will negotiate with
Yo
Iran
venía
over AMIA.
hablando de diálogo con
I
la AMIA en
had
los
been
discursos
talking
que di en
about
la
the
ONU en el
dialogue with
2009, en el
Iran
2010, en el 2011.
ever since
Lo que pasa es que el diario
2009.
anterior había puesto otro
But of course,
título,
the
había puesto que
newspaper
yo no iba a
had
hablar de Irán. Entonces
published a
hablé
different
con el
headline the
título
day
y poner
before, said
que yo
that I
dije
wouldn't
en
talk
realidad
about
yo venía diciendo
Iran, and in
exactamente
fact,
lo
I was
mismo.
fully consistent. I said
Y
exactly the
la
same
verdad
things I
que
had been saying
uno está en
before.
Argentina y por
And
ahí
you're in
habla y dice
Argentina, and
blanco,
sometimes you say
y el
white,
otro
and the next
día,
day,
pero no ya en
forget
conferencia de
about press
prensa, estoy
conferences. I'm
hablando
talking.
y
I
digo
say
blanco
white,
y el otro día
and the
sale
next
publicado
day
la presidenta
it
de
says
blanco
the
negro.
president said
Y
black.
esto se puede
And
verificar totalmente.
this
Yo
can
creo que hay
be
en realidad
perfectly
una
checked.
percepción y creo que hay una
I
toma de
think
posición
there are
respecto de muchas
positions
cosas.
that are already
Pero quédate
taken
tranquila
in many
porque
respects,
hablo
but
puntual. La última
the last
conferencia que di
conference
creo
I
que
gave was
fue cuando estuvo
when
Hillary en
Hillary
Argentina, ¿no?
Clinton visited
Fue con Hillary
Argentina.
Clinton. Ahora, esta
Now,
tipo de
giving
conferencia todos los
conferences
días
every
no me parece
day,
que
I don't
sea
think
la obligación
is
de
the
una
obligation of a
presidenta. Yo
president.
tengo
I
gobernado.
need to
Y las
govern,
conferencias dan mis
and
funcionarios.
conferences are for my
Mis
officials,
funcionarios
and my
hablan todos los
officials speak
días.
every day.
El Ministerio del Interior,
The
el
Minister
Ministerio
of the
de
Interior, the
Economía, acaba
Minister
de ir
of Economy,
el viceministro de
the
Economía,
Deputy
Excellency Cristina
Economy
Fernández, para
Minister
todas las preguntas del
has gone
presupuesto.
to answer all
El
questions
titular de
on
la
the
JIT da
budget.
conferencias de prensa
The head of the Tax
permanentemente.
Authority
El
gives
ministro del Interior da
conferences,
conferencias de
the
prensa
Ministry of the Interior
permanentemente.
too,
El ministro de
the Planning
Planificación da
Minister as
conferencias
well.
permanentemente. Ahora, me parece que esto me parece como un
Now, I
una
think
muletilla.
it's
O sea,
almost
yo
a set
creo que
phrase
puede haber muchísimas críticas
that
que
I
hacer,
don't give conferences.
pero
There
me
may be a
parece
lot of
que
criticism,
o
or
tal vez sea
perhaps
que no encuentran el lado
they
por donde
don't
quieran
see
criticarme y
where to
entonces
criticize, and
sea esto, pero sinceramente no me
I
llama la
find it
atención. No
remarkable.
me enoja,
It
está
doesn't
claro,
make me
porque
angry.
realidad
I mean,
no
at
me
this
enoja y además
stage,
eso
and
de
you know,
enojarse
getting
es una
angry
droga de
is bad for
salud
your health,
y te salen
and
arrugas
you
cuando
get
enojas
more
mucho,
wrinkles
así que
when you
no
get
vale la pena.
angry.
Paciencia,
So,
paciencia y seguir
patience and
adelante. Muchas gracias,
working
querido.
more.
General
General
Pico de la
Pico
Pampa
from
eras,
La
¿no?
Pampa, right?
General Pico de la Pampa eras vos, no.
But
No,
from
de
General
Pico de la Pampa o
Pico
del Archivo
from
del
San
Perú.
Juan.
Ah, de San Juan.
What
¿De qué
part of
parte
San
de
Juan are you
sos?
from?
De San Juan, la
From the capital
San Juan
city.
capital. Qué bien. Qué bien que anda el país. ¿Cuánta
So
gente del
the
interior
country
del
is doing
país
very
quiere
well.
ser
A lot of
acá?
people born in
Igual
Argentina
es.
could study in Harvard.
Sí. ¿Alguna otra pregunta más?
Any other questions?
Gracias. No, we need to quit now.
No, sí, por favor, déjelo.
Please
porque
go
si
ahead,
no
let
está
him.
para el y está
And
con
he's
un
got a piece of paper
papelito.
there.
Y
Leo
está,
Tomorrow.
y está
He's
con
got a
un
piece of
papelito.
paper there.
A ver, dale. Léete el papelito
Read out
con
the
el que te
paper you
viniste,
came with.
dale.
No, it's not to read out.
Dale.
First and foremost, welcome to Boston.
Gracias.
I'm from Salta. But what part of Salta are you from? From the capital city? Beautiful. And I don't know what headline the newspaper will publish, because it may not be the question they want me to ask. It's not about the past, but about the present, because some newspapers, I know there have been lots of emails and journalists have been writing questions, but it's part of freedom too, it's good. Let's not fool ourselves. We're all adults. I'm all ears. In a very complex world, my studies are in business, not here at Harvard, but I really respect this institution very highly. And I see that you always say that water, food, technology and energy are the keys to the future in the long term for the whole world. I always thought that social responsibility should also be part of that set of notions. because responsibility is not only incumbent upon politicians, but also on business leaders. As part of the as member of the G20, and since you have talks with other leaders, what is your position on the importance of social responsibility looking forward and at the long term, not for the economy in Argentina, but generally worldwide? You speak about social responsibility as a business concept mainly, and management concept or administrative concept. Yes, the social responsibility of companies, corporate social responsibility, being environmentally conscious, trying to invest in the communities where they work, to allow alternative development and so on. Yes, I fully agree. In fact, I think it's one of the most important things being done at present. Bernardo Klicksberg is working a lot on that concept of corporate social responsibility, and obviously giving benefits to companies that include the environmental label or the corporate social responsibility label on their packages. Let me be frank, there's not much talk about that within the G20. I have personally tried to deal with the issue of tax havens with not much luck. I have also tried to bring up the issue of capital transfer regulations to avoid speculative attacks on the currencies and economies, and also development in infrastructure and others as mechanisms for reactivation. But the G20 is a forum that is quite new, and it does have its complexities, but there hasn't been much talk about social responsibility. There has been some discussion among business leaders who accompany the G20 on the sidelines, on the margins, just like you now have trade unions representatives who also meet on the margins. But we will be taking that up. I think it's a good idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. No, I do insist. Please go ahead.
Last question.
El último.
Ok, aprovecho la generosidad.
Thank you for your
Para hacer una
kindness.
pregunta nada más.
I will
Hace
ask you a
poco el
question.
Instituto Nacional de Estadística en Argentina hizo alguna declaración.
There were some statements in Argentina about an Argentine citizen being able to eat. Yes, an article has been published by the head of the statistics office.
Perfecto, entonces,
Brilliant.
cambio un segundo
So then
para aprovechar la
I will
oportunidad.
change
Nada más,
briefly.
habiendo, bueno, y habiendo discutido
Since
un poco todo sobre los
we
derechos
have
humanos y
discussed the issue of human rights, and
yo me pregunto y cito un poco sus
and
declaraciones.
I
¿Por qué un
quote
ciudadano
you,
argentino
why
tiene que tenerle un
does
poquito
an
de
Argentine
miedo
citizen
a la
have to
presidenta?
be a little afraid of the president? See, that's another distortion. See, that's another issue they distort. What did I say? Exactly. And you can check the records and play them here. On the contrary, what I said was that those who had to be afraid of me were my officials. What did Clarín do? It edited, Clarín newspaper edited my statement and said that people had to be afraid of God and of myself. And I said that my officials had to be a little afraid of me because I was being critical. See, they were asking me for some self-criticism. I was criticizing some policies or decisions that I didn't think were appropriate and could have been done in a better way. I didn't refer to the citizens, of course, and besides, it would have been very silly of me if I had said that with regard to citizens. I wouldn't be evil, I would be silly. And I don't think anyone or you would believe I'm silly. I specifically refer to my officials when I said that. So I would like to ask you to see the full video.
también son ciudadanos.
Gracias.
but they're also
Yes,
citizens. They are also citizens.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias.